dynamic cycles and systems. Right? It's associated with something called resilience thinking, or resilience theory. It's an expression that's associated with complexity science. But what it basically demonstrates, or tries to summarize, is the kind of dynamic pattern that systems go through within a single spatial scale. Right? This is the particular thing. So a point is to understand at a particular scale, you identify the level of organization that you want to look at, the cycle that it goes through. The idea is that things will grow, mature, and then collapse, and grow and mature and collapse, and then grow and mature and collapse, over and over and over again. And that pattern is supported because the environment, the larger system, constrains what can happen on that landscape. But there are also, the example I should give you, the sort of classic one that we use, is the example of succession in a forest patch. Right? So you have, say, a grassland that grows into a forest, goes through a period of succession. You get grasses and shrubs and opportunistic tree species, and then you get the longer living hardwoods, and eventually you get this, mature climax community. When I was in grade school, they said, okay, well, that's the end. Well, that's not really the end. Then you have a fire, or then you have pests, and that system is destroyed, right? And then you again start the whole process again. The idea is that it sort of goes back between these two phases over and over. And that these are themselves nested in these sort of nested holarchies or hierarchies, right? So you have, smaller forest patches within the larger forest, which is within the biome, that kind of thing. And then you can go down as well. You can look at the level of the crown of the tree or on the leaf. Each kind of scale you can identify at which level of organization appears. You can identify these kinds of dynamic kind of cycles. And you can, there's human system analogies as well. People have characterized the Soviet Union, the fall of the Berlin Wall, and the fall of the Roman Empire. All sorts of different things. Organizational change has been described in this way. There's a whole institute and organization formed around something called social innovation, which applies this exact model to making social change in, say, poor neighborhoods or crime, that kind of thing. But still, it's sort of simplistic. Because when we look at, reality, when we have a problem, and we try to identify everything that is, we're talking about integration, everything that is of concern, of interest in that problem, when we look at our world, we start looking at things that don't always correspond to the same scale, but we're still interested in them. So, for example, we have, we have, say, systems that will involve social components, human components, physical components, infrastructure components, governance issues, right? Our watershed, if you're interested in it, might be embedded within a province. The province operates at a different scale than does the watershed. Or it might have a governance system that corresponds to, overlaps with multiple watersheds. And these kinds of spatial scales don't always exactly match. I'm going to get back to that issue in a second. Another important thing to think about when we talk about this nested hierarchy kind of idea is that there are relationships, not just within a system that define that level of organization, but there's cross-scale and within-scale relationships. And these are things that that constrain from the larger levels what the smaller levels can do, but also there's influence from smaller levels into higher levels, right? So, for example, if processes, a large number of forest patches become synchronized, for example, then they can collapse the level above them. This is what we do when we try to suppress forest fires, right? We suppress a fire at the forest patch level long enough, then the fuel builds up, and what we get is larger and hotter fires that tend to destroy larger areas, burn towns, and that kind of thing. And that's the influence of smaller levels into the higher levels. Getting back to that point about multiple phenomena maybe having different spatial manifestations. You know, it's nice and clean to start constructing diagrams like this one, where you can see a nice, you know, clear kind of nesting of one within the other. But when we look at the phenomena that we need to deal with, it's sort of more like this diagram. It's a little funky to look at, but you can start to perceive different kinds of patterns in this that operate at different scales. And so, you know, if we might think of, you know, these more circular ones as human systems, and the more edgy ones as natural systems, you can see them sort of overlapping and not quite corresponding. And some of them building up each other, but not all of them. It's more of a sort of mishmash like this. It's not quite as thin as we would think of this sort of nesting when we want to integrate across the human and natural worlds. So, for example, my colleagues and I deal with social determinants of health and environmental determinants of health. And those two sets of determinants don't always match in terms of the spatial scale on which, say, governance or the management structures are developed around them. But that doesn't mean that we don't have to deal with them. So what do we do then? I promised Karen Morrison that I would end with a picture of a watershed. So there it is.
Well, that's what it is.
I'd like to suggest that what you need to do is find a most representative scale to anchor the approach at, recognizing that there are multiple influencing kinds of factors that might also pertain to other scales. And that you need to find the most useful and practical kind of construct that will allow you to tie in all of those other factors. And the watershed is one of those very useful spatial constructs that has a natural nesting in terms of the spatial scale, right? Smaller watersheds exist within larger watersheds, exist within larger, larger catchment areas. And within those spatial constructs, you can see the manifestations of some kinds of driving forces on the landscape. So, for example, this diagram it tries to represent some of the impacts of global climate change drivers at the landscape level. So you can look at things like water quality, agriculture, water supply, water, everything, right? Because it's a watershed, there's this hydrological imperative that drives all sorts of impacts when water is affected by things like external driving forces of climate change. But some of these other things will have other kinds of spatial units of organization. And we have to recognize that we need to deal with these issues, even though, you know, your health unit might not correspond to your watershed unit. Your municipal government, you know, municipal boundaries might not correspond to your watershed unit. These are the places where the actual impacts that you're concerned with actually manifest. And it's a good spatial unit, but it's not the only one. One of the last points I wanted to make, I actually forgot to make it earlier, with respect to these sort of dynamic kind of cycles, is that there seems to be, it's like these special numbers of mathematics. There seems to be patterns that appear universally. And one of the things that can be observed about scale is that there are certain levels of organization depending on your perspective, your interest in the situation. And there's these nested holarchies, and in between, there does not seem to be organization. There seems to be organization as you go down into the smaller scales. There's nothing, then there's organization, then there's nothing, then there's organization. As you go up, it's the same way. There's nothing, there's organization, there's nothing, there's organization. It happens over space, and it happens over time. And this is an observation that we can make use of. We can make use of it in order to understand, you know, how things are actually organized out there in a general kind of principle, and then apply them to problems when we're trying to sort of organize our understanding of the world. Now, that was a very academic treatment of scale, and I only sort of scratched the surface, or some of those concepts might not have been very well explained, but I welcome anybody to sort of corner me later during a break if you're interested in that kind of thing, and I want some more more explanation.